Hey guys, we're moving forward in our David series this week. We've got just 1 week left after this. We're going to be looking at David as a man after God's own heart tomorrow, and particularly we're going to be focusing in on David's emotional life and how he's a man of passion who strongly experiences emotion. I think that's a big piece of what it means when it calls David a man after God's own heart. Particularly, we're going to focus on how David is able to feel a deep sorrow and grief and mourning and anger and wrath, these negative emotions, alongside a really strong faith, and how those two can coexist and should coexist in the life of a Christian, how they coexist in David's life and even in God's life. And so that's where we're going tomorrow. You can start out with the usual question to see if anybody has things that they want to focus on, stuff that stood out, stuff they have questions about, anything like that. The second question, I'll kind of hit on a little bit at the end of the lesson, talking about how a lot of people hit one extreme or the other. They're either really strongly emotional people, they feel strongly, and sometimes that slips into sinful anger, sinful sadness and emotion. And then on the other hand, there are people who kind of suppress and push down emotion and don't feel things maybe perhaps as they ought to. And so you're just going to ask students which one they think they're more prone to be overly emotional, or to be a person who suppresses emotion and doesn't feel things perhaps the way that a Christian should. So that's just to get them thinking about that. Should be an easy question, but they may need some time to sit and think. I may need to be pressed on that one. Next is we'll talk a little bit about how to protect from the side of being super emotional, too angry, too sad, allowing that to slip into sinful sorrow or anger, with the guardrail of faith. Faith is what kind of keeps our emotion from spilling over into being sinful and prolonged. But we won't talk quite as much about the other side. How do we solve this side of Christians who are maybe a little apathetic? They don't feel and certainly don't process through or speak about emotion quite as much. How do we solve that? If that is something that we should be doing, we should, like David and like Christ and God himself, feel emotions, even negative emotions, really strongly and passionately. How do we get to that point? And I've got a couple of solutions for you there. That first one I'll talk about a little bit in the lesson. The next two is just recognizing that there's a lot at stake in life. This life is serious, it has eternal consequences to it, and things that are really serious and really high stakes should have serious emotional responses to them. Life is not as casual as oftentimes we can think. And another one is a lot of times this lack of sorrow and a lack of maybe anger and frustration at the injustices of the world and around us can come from a lack of love for other people. And you can see that especially if you're really sad and really angry and offended when things happen to you, but you are not moved much when those same things or similar things happen to other people. And I'm sure there's other solutions that you or students can add in there about how someone who is kind of suppressing and pushing down emotion through a Christian worldview might open that up to look a little bit more like David and a little bit more like God himself. Number 4, how do you think that this could be? And by this I mean Christians living out an emotional life, even experiencing sorrow and grief and mourning and anger, allowing ourselves to experience those things, but experiencing them under control. How can that be a good tool in winning people to Christ, a good evangelistic tool? And I've got a couple of thoughts for you there. Again, I'm sure you and students can add things in there, but I think our culture is highly emotional right now and struggling with that emotion. There's a lot of pent-up anger and frustration and aggression that people have towards various things, and there's a lot of elevation in cases of depression and mental illness and hopelessness and suicide rates are all on the rise. People are feeling things really strongly, and they're really struggling to feel them in a healthy and a biblical way. They're struggling to feel these emotions but not have them spill over, which is something we'll talk about tomorrow in the main lesson. So I think us doing that well and us counseling others to do that well and telling other people how we can do that well can be a stunning, shocking way to live in a culture that is really struggling with this area. And then lastly, how does the lesson today maybe affect how we interact with and counsel other Christians who are feeling some of these negative emotions? A Christian who is really struck by depression or sadness or grief, or really angry and really frustrated at something. I think, again, I've got some bullet points there for you. Obviously, every case is different. It depends what they're angry about, what they're sad about, to what degree they're angry and sad. But I think in general, and I'll talk about this a little in the lesson, but it'd be good to drive this home further. As Christians, we sometimes mess up in the lane of we just want people to cheer up. We think Christians should always be happy, and that if we really believed in God, we wouldn't be as sad about tragedies in the world. Maybe we wouldn't be as mad about things, and we can try to counsel people to move quickly out of negative emotion, cheer up, give them a Bible verse. If you believe this, you'll feel better. And oftentimes, that's not necessarily the right approach. And so that may need to adjust how we interact and counsel other people. Sometimes we need to sit and mourn with them. We need to allow them to experience the emotions that they're feeling. Maybe they're feeling them rightly, and they should process through that and take time to do that. How long that should take place is a whole different question, a difficult question, a longer question. I think one thing I thought of, they do this is a part of the Chosen, is they sit Shiva, which is kind of after someone passes away, they just sit in the darkness and on the floor and kind of mourn for 7 days. And this wasn't prescribed by the law, but it was a pretty common practice in Judaism. It's certainly quite possible, maybe even likely, that Jesus would have done this himself, which is maybe for us today, like, we would think that's too far. Like, sitting on the ground in the darkness, doing nothing but being sad for an entire week sounds terrible and horrible. And how does that coexist with faith and joy and confidence in Christ and in the resurrection? But obviously, that's kind of what the point of the lesson will be. Those two aren't as in conflict as we might think. So there's some food for thought for discussion groups tomorrow. I'll see you guys then. Let me know if you have any questions.